Hello, in this video, I'm going to talk about CSS selectors. Before we learn about CSS selectors, it will be helpful to learn how CSS works. So you learned about what a CSS is in a previous video. So let's look at how a browser uses CSS to display an HTML page. So when a browser loads an HTML page, it will parse the HTML into a DOM tree. And while it's parsing the HTML, it will run into a directive to either load a CSS style sheet or whether the CSS style sheet is embedded or in line within the element. And then as it's about to render the DOM tree into the display, it will look at all the CSS rules that it's collected for that particular element, and then it will apply all the style elements. So what constitutes a style element? So anything that changes the way an element is displayed. As you may imagine, there are many CSS rules, there are many different styles, and we will only learn a subset of that in this class. But it is important that you understand how a rule is applied to an element, because otherwise it's all going to be a mystery and it's going to be very confusing. So the way the browser detects which rule should be applied to where, that will be based on the DOM and also the selector in the rule itself. As we remember from a previous video, a CSS rule consists of the selector and then the rule itself, which is a collection of property and value pair. So let's look at some of the common selectors. So these are some of the common selectors. So the first one is universal selector, a star. So anything that is marked with this selector will be applied to everything in the page. And you can also select elements based on their element names or type selector. And in this case, this rule will apply to all H1, H2, and H3 elements. And if you remember, there's a special attribute called class. And class have a different notation. So for example, if you have an element with a class called note, this rule will apply to that element. And how about this one? This one is combination between type and class selector. So this will apply to all elements of type P, paragraph, but it will only apply to paragraphs who has a class attribute equals to note. And the last common selector is an ID selector, and it is a shorthand for matching elements with certain ID attribute. And the shorthand is just the hash mark or the pound sign. So this will apply to one element that has the ID introduction. So ID in HTML element has to be unique. So given an ID, you expect to see only one element with that ID. Okay, so let's look at the next set of common selector before we look at an example. So this next set of common selector is based on the relationship between elements in the DOM tree. So if you remember, the DOM tree is an upside down tree, and the root is the document, and followed by the HTML element, and then there'll be a parent and child relationship between elements of a DOM tree. So a child selector, a direct child selector, is this. So that's the greater than sign. So This will select all anchor element, which is a direct descendant of this list item element. It will not select the anchor element that is the grandchildren of this li element. So it has to be direct. Now, the other selector that based on parent-child and descendant relationship is the descendant selector. And in this case, it will pick up all children, all grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that happen to match. So for example, this one, any anchor element that is a descendant of this paragraph element will be matching this selector. And since in a hierarchical DOM tree you have sibling relationship as well, you can select siblings in a selector as well. And the next two are sibling selector. The first one is adjacent sibling, so it's the sibling that's right next to an element. We'll see an example of that in a minute. So here it will only apply to a paragraph that directly follow an H1 element. And the next selector is general sibling. So it will match any sibling of H1 in this case, as long as the sibling is a P. So it doesn't have to be directly following. So let's look at an example. And I am going to use this example from the book. Okay, so this is a text file that contains the HTML that's being used as an example in the book. So first, let's create an embedded style sheet. And I am going to use the universal selector, the star. And that should apply to all elements in the page. So let's say star. Let's make the color red. But before we do this, let's view the page in a browser so that we know what it looks like. So this is a view of the page before I apply the universal selector. Let's go back to our page and let's make the text color say blue. Oh, let's make it red actually, because the anchor text are blue. I want to make everything red, so this will be a little bit more, a little bit different. Okay, so let's go back to the preview page, and everything is red, including the anchor link. Now let's look at the next selector. The next selector is the type selector. So let's just make the anchor link, the A element, red. So we can do that. So instead of everything red, let's just make just anchor links red. And let's view the preview again. And here you can see all the anchors are red. How about this one? This looks like an H1 element, but why is it red? So let's have a look at what the actual code is. We can look at it in our text editor. And here you could see that this is actually an anchor element inside an H1. So that's why the color applies. You can also debug this by looking at the developer tools. So just press the developer tool shortcut and look at the element, and you could see that's the A element, the anchor element that's being colored red because of our CSS rule. And you could see where exactly this rule comes from. It comes from the embedded CSS rule inside the HTML itself. If I want to play around, I can uncheck this and it will remove this rule. And the color is back to black. Okay, so let's look at the next rule. First, let's close this. So the next selector is a class selector. So I need to have an element or two that have a class attribute. So let's look at our HTML. Is there anything that has a class? Oh yeah, there's one thing that has the class note. Let's change this so that it will pick up the class note. That's the notation. And let's switch to our sample. And here, this is the note, the element that has an attribute class equals to note, and it is red. And but you say, why are these blue? That's because these are anchor link, and anchor link have their own rule, and since the anchor have a smaller scope and more specific, that's why that rule wins out. So let's have a look. So this is our paragraph that has the class note, and you can see that there is the CSS rule that's applicable. Let's open this up. So this paragraph has two anchor elements as its children, and the anchor element have a rule that comes from an A rule that is a user agent style sheet. So that means it's a style sheet that comes built into the browser that I'm using. In this case, it's Chrome. And the rule is overriding the color, and that's why the color is getting crossed out. Okay, so let's look at our next selector. Our next selector is ID selector, and it's just a hash mark and then the ID name, so we can do that. So let's look at things that have ID. So this anchor have an ID top, and this paragraph has ID introduction. So I can apply a couple of selectors here. So if you do a comma separated selector, it will be a list of selector, and it will match any of the selectors that you have in the comma separated list. So in this case, I'm going to do pound introduction. So with this, I expect that this paragraph will be red and this paragraph will stay red. So let's save this and let's go to our browser. And that's exactly what happened. So this is one way to list different selectors, and if any one of the selector match, it will apply the rule. If I apply the rule without a comma, something like this, this means the class has to be note and the ID has to be introduction, which is shown here in the preview. And if you see, we don't have any element with that that will meet that selector. We have element with ID introduction. We have an element with class equals to note, but we don't have an element that meet both selector. So in this case, this selector is not going to be applied. And if I go back to my browser, nothing is read. So how do I make this to fire? So I can add class equals to note here. So class attribute, you can have many elements in the HTML page with that same class. It's normally being used to specify that this particular style apply to everybody from this class. Just like everybody in the web application development class has to meet on Wednesday. So this is so a class is an attribute to say that you want to treat a whole bunch of elements as a unit. So in this case, so let's add the class attribute node. So now we have an element that meet this selector because it has both class node and ID introduction. Let's save this and go back here. So we expect only this will be red, this one is not going to be read because even though it has the class name, the correct class name, it does not have the correct ID. And this is what we have. So that's the first 4 of the common selector. Let's look at the selectors that work based on the relationship between elements in a DOM tree. So first, let's draw the DOM tree for our document. So this is our document, and the easiest way to look at the DOM tree is just use the developer tools. So if you open the developer tools, it should tell you the hierarchy. So in this case, you have the document, and then there's the one HTML element in the document, and then you have 2 direct children of the HTML element, head and body. So let's concentrate on the body. Body have H1, P element, H2 element, UL element, another P element, and yet another P element as its direct children. So this script element is an injected code, so we're not going to count it. We're going to just ignore this. So what's the difference between these elements that have the triangle versus elements that don't have triangle? Elements with triangle meaning is an indicator that they have more children. So if I open the H1, you could see the H1 element, this H1 element has 1 children, which is an A element. Okay, so let's draw this as a real tree. So we have the document itself, and then the document have an HTML node, and then the HTML node has 2 children, the head and body, and then the body has many children. There is the H1, and we know that the H1 have an A element as a child, and then there is the P element, this one. This P element does not have any children, and then the next element is H2. H2 does not have any children. We have a UL element, which has children. We don't know yet. We'll need to look into that. And there's a P element that has children as well. And there's another P element with children. So let's look at the UL. UL have many LI element, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 LI element. And then each one of those LI element have an anchor element for children. So there are 6 children, and each one of those children have children themselves. So we should draw that. So the unordered list element has 6 list items. LI, and each one of the list item have a child, which is an A element. And let's look at the first paragraph that have the class note. So this has 2 A element as children, and this next paragraph has just 1 A element as its sole child. So this P has 2 children, A, and this other P has another just 1 child. And that's the complete DOM tree of this page. So now let's play with our CSS rule. So the first CSS rule is just the direct parent, right? The greater than sign. So in this case, we can make it so that all of the anchor link that is a child of a paragraph element, they should have the color pink. Okay? So everything, all the anchor link that is the child of a P element. So that means 1, 2, 3, not this, and none of the anchor link that is a child of list item. Oh, how do you get rid of this? All right, there we go. So none of this A element will be effective. We're only after these 3. So let's do that. So we want the color pink. And we want all of anchor element that is a direct child of a paragraph. And let's go back and have a look. So 1, 2, and 3. And that corresponds to this and that. And how about if I want to be more specific, just direct child of this particular paragraph? In this case, I need to be able to identify this paragraph. So how do I identify it? I can say, well, only if the paragraph has the class node. That's one way to do it. Because there's only one paragraph that have class node and have anchor elements as its direct children. But if you're worried about this paragraph having an anchor element getting added and you don't want that to be affected, then one way you can do this is by using the sibling relationship. But let's add the class node first to our rule and see that to make sure that that works the way we expected. Okay, so let's go back here. So we only want direct children of paragraph that has a class node. Save this. So we only expect these 2 anchor. Hold on, let me enable word wrap. So these 2 anchor should be affected. The other one should be the default color, and that's what happens. And now we talk about the sibling relationship. So in this case, let's look at the sibling selector. So we want a paragraph that is a direct sibling of an unordered list to be the one that's affected. So that's another way to select that particular paragraph. So see this paragraph, it's a direct sibling, so it's following right after this unordered list. If you look at our drawing, this paragraph follows directly after the UL node. So let's do that. So paragraph that is a direct sibling of a UL. And we only want to hit the anchor elements that are the direct children of that paragraph. Save this and let's see what happens. And it has the same result because we select this paragraph and we click here and we look at this anchor link. You will see that that rule applies because we select the paragraph and then we select the anchor, which is direct children of this paragraph. Okay, so let's go back to our document. And how about if we just want to hit all the anchor link in here? So I can't use direct children. I can't say, well, everything that's a direct children of a UL, that won't work. But this one will work. So that means it will select each one of these list items, and then it will color it pink. So that's one way to select that using direct children relationship. Another way to select that is using the descendant selector. So in this case, I want to say all of the anchor link under the UL element. So all of these anchor link here under this, which is a descendant of this, I want to make, I want to change the color to pink. so I can do that. So instead of li, I can use ul, and that should have the same result. And if we look at it, and it does not have the same result. Oh, did I forget to remove the, yes, I forget to remove the direct child. This is direct child. I want it to be descendant, so let's save this. And now it applies. So the direct descendant does not work for this because all these anchor elements, they're not direct descendant of the unordered list, but they are descendant of the unordered list. They're actually grandchildren of this element, so the descendant rule applies. Okay, so we've played with the first three. So how about the general sibling selector? Okay, so for this, let's target this 2 paragraph, which is following this unordered list. So we want any paragraph that is a sibling following this unordered list, although not necessarily immediately. So in this case, we just have ul and then tilde p, and then we want to change the color of that paragraph to, say, red. So we expect the last 2 paragraphs to be affected with this, like this. Save this, and let's have a look. So we expect it to affect this paragraph and this next paragraph. But why is this next paragraph not red? That's because the whole text is just an anchor text, and it has a more specific rule that applies to it that makes it have the color blue. So in this case, let's add some text in there so that we could tell if it's actually changing. Let's add goto. Save this, and let's have a look. And as you can see, the goto text is now red. So that general sibling selector will select all siblings following the ul element, but not the sibling preceding the ul element. Okay, so that's the 4 selectors related to the DOM tree. How about the other attribute selector? So attribute selector match certain attributes, so whether an attribute exists. So if you want to hit all the paragraphs that have the class attribute, you can do this. So here, if we want to hit all paragraphs that have a class attribute, we will hit this paragraph. We will select this paragraph and this other paragraph. So we can select that. And let's see what the result look like. And these 2 becomes red. And let's look at the next selector. So equality will search for a particular value of the attribute. So instead of using .note to match all elements that have class equals to note, I can also use this equality to check that. So class equals to, and that should have the same result. So these 2 will be red. But if we change one of these classes into note 2 instead of note, then we'll only have this one red. Because now we're checking the value of the class attribute. If we don't check the value of the class attribute, we just want to check that the class attribute exists, then we will still get the other paragraph. So if I remove the equality, then you will have these 2 paragraphs becomes red. And one thing to note about the class attribute is a class attribute can contain multiple classes. So I can say that this is also source class, not just node. So if I actually check for equality, this class attribute is not going to be equal to node because the class attribute is actually node source. So this is not going to kick in for any of the elements. So let's look at it. And it's not kicking in for this paragraph. But if you use the dot notation, p.node, so paragraph that has a class node, that should still pick up this paragraph, as you can see in here. So be careful when you use equality attribute for class, because it may not match an element that belongs to multiple classes. So the next attribute selector, the space selector, actually the one that will help us do class matching, just like the dot notation, because it will match any one of the value in a space separated list. So in this case, instead of using equal, instead of using class equals to node like this, I'm going to add the tilde. So that means I will match any element who has a class attribute that has node as one of the value listed in a space separated set of values. So in this case, this will this paragraph will match. Now, hold on, I have a typo here, so it should be tilde equal, and it should be happier. And let's look at it, and yes, now it matched again. So instead of using plain equality, use tilde equal, and it will behave just like the dot node. Okay, so that is the second attribute selector. And let's look at the next attribute selector. That's just a prefix. So I can also use this if I assume that the node class is always the first one listed. I can use the prefix instead of the tilde, and that should still match. So let me go back here, and so in this case, yes, this still match, but then we also pick up this paragraph in the match because the value of the class attribute start with the word node, because prefix will just blindly match the values, and as long as the prefix match, then it is a match. And you can also just match a substring, so anywhere in the attribute value, so that's this operator. And you can also do a suffix match instead. So for a substring, let's look at our example. So I can just match the substring hour. So in this case, it should match just this paragraph. So I'm going to do a substring match. And we're going to match the substring hour. And it matched just this one because it matched the source attribute here. And for the last one, which is just a suffix, so for a suffix, I can match the number 2 here, so because this is a suffix, so I can do that. So that's a dollar for suffix match. So I expect that this one will be red. Let's go to Chrome, and that's indeed what we have because the suffix match. So it does not have to be a class attribute. It could be any attribute. I can call this attribute something else. Say I'm going to call it my class attribute instead of the standard class attribute. I have to match this attribute name, and it should still match. If I don't change the attribute name to my class here, if I'm just using class attribute, then nothing will match. Okay, so we've gone through and played with all the selectors listed in the slides, and that, and that. And so now what will happen is there are more than one rules that apply to an element. So for example, I have a rule for P, and then I have another rule for P, and I'm going to color it blue instead. Which one will win? So the later one will win. So if I save this, you will see that all my text will be blue. But how about these? How about this one is black? And where's this black as well? So for that, we need to look at what happened. So in this case, I'm just coloring all paragraph, right? So that's why this H2 and H1 are not getting colored. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that if there are two rules that apply to a particular element, one of the rule is actually more specific. So for example, one of the rule is just a rule for paragraph here, but then I also specify that if the paragraph has the class note, I'm going to color it red. So here you can see that this rule comes first and the general paragraph rule comes later. This is not going to override this rule. So that means this paragraph will still be red. So let's look at it. And indeed, that is the case. Now, the reason that this rule is not overriding the first rule is that this rule is more general. So it's going to apply to more elements than this other rule that has more qualifier. So that is the first two rules of CSS rules cascade. And then you can mark a rule with this important after the property value. And in that case, it doesn't matter where the rule is, it will always win. It is actually not recommended that you use the important indicator because what if you have multiple things with the same important property? Let's look at an example. So we know that this rule wins out, but if we want this one to be the one winning, then we should just do the bang important. All right, let's mark this as important. So we expect that this paragraph instead of red now is going to be blue because we mark this blue rule as important and it should take precedence. So let's go here, and it is indeed blue. Remember that you're not supposed to use this unless it's really important. So don't use it if you can avoid it. Some attributes can be inherited from one element to another. So if I set the color, the font color of the body element, that will get inherited by everything that is descendant of the body. So instead of P, I'm going to say body, and everything in the body is going to be red. So if we go here, you will see that everything here, unless it's overridden by something else, such as all these anchor elements, they're all changed to red. Why? Because all of these inherit the color from the body. So if we select one of these paragraphs, you will see that the color is getting picked up from the body color. Another example of property that will get inherited by a child element is font family. Things that are not inherited are background color, border, attributes. So if you set the background color of the body, it won't be inherited by other elements. And if you set the border of the body, it's not going to be inherited by everything in that body. So we can go there. So border is not inheritable, so we can say border solid. So the body will have a solid border, as you can see here, but then the child element does not have the border. It will be really weird if everybody have the border, so we can use the universal selector. Now everything will have a color red and it will have a border, as you can see in here. So CSS rules have a lot of power, and you need to be able to control this power by selecting the proper element using the CSS selector. And if things does not work the way you expected, as you've seen in many occasions in this video, you can always use the developer tool to try to troubleshoot the problem. Okay, so that's all the CSS selector that you need to know for this course. I hope this video helps. Bye now.